When a corrupt court, disregarding the laws of the United States, attempts to convict Vice President JD Vance with a web of lies, Vance reveals his hand and shows what truly happened. The San Francisco courtroom was teeming with tension. The gallery was packed to the brim with reporters, their whispers filling the air like the hum of bees. The relentless flashes of cameras painted brief scenes of the room, frozen in stark clarity. The imposing bench of Judge Edward Greer, the rows of jurors watching closely, and, at the center of it all, JD Vance himself, the Vice President of the United States. Judge Greer, draped in black robes and exuding an air of arrogance, surveyed the room. His cold, calculating eyes betrayed none of the cunning that Vance knew lurked beneath. Greer was infamous in political circles as a man entangled with the local elite, trading favors in smoky backrooms where laws bent to the highest bidder. Today, he wore his signature smirk, a sardonic expression that seemed to mock both the law and those who upheld it. Vice President Vance, Greer began, his voice dripping with feigned authority. The charges against you are grave. Abuse of power, coercion, and financial misconduct. If proven, they threaten not only your career but the very integrity of this nation's highest office. JD Vance sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped before him. His calm demeanor was a mask, concealing the storm of strategy brewing within. He knew the allegations were fabricated, a desperate ploy to ruin him, and he knew exactly who had pulled the strings. Across the room, a projector clicked to life, throwing a grainy chart onto a screen. The evidence, Greer declared, gesturing to the projection, clearly demonstrates a pattern of illicit behavior. This court must decide. Vance interrupted, his voice steady but firm. Objection, Your Honor. It is improper for a judge to present evidence. Greer's smirk widened, and he leaned forward, his gavel poised. Objection overruled. You will respect this court's proceedings. The reporters in the gallery leaned in, their pens flying across notepads. The room seemed to tremble with the weight of the moment. Greer continued, as I was saying, this evidence. With all due respect, Your Honor, Vance interjected again. The so-called evidence is speculative at best. My legal team. The gavel struck sharply, cutting through the air. Enough! Greer snapped. His smirk twisted into something darker. Vice President Vance, this is my courtroom. You will speak only when spoken to. The gallery fell silent. All eyes were on Vance, whose own gaze remained locked on Greer. There was no fear in his expression, only a steely resolve. The silence stretched, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire room held its breath. Vance broke the quiet with a simple phrase. The truth will come out. Greer chuckled, a low, mocking sound. We'll see about that. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Reporters whispered among themselves, their minds racing with the drama unfolding before them. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions unreadable. And yet, amidst it all, Vance sat like an anchor in a storm, unwavering. Outside the courthouse, the city pulsed with its usual chaos. Protesters gathered, their chants both in support of and against the vice president, creating a cacophony that mirrored the divisions of the nation. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to broadcast every second of the trial. Back inside, the proceedings moved forward, but Vance's mind was already 3 steps ahead. He knew Greer's game. He had seen men like him before, men who believed their power placed them above the law. And he knew how to dismantle them piece by piece. His attorney, a shrewd and seasoned litigator named Eleanor Parks, leaned close to him. We're walking a fine line here, JD. Let him overplay his hand. The moment will come. Vance nodded slightly. It's not just his hand I'm waiting for. We have our own cards to play. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but Vance said no more. He wouldn't reveal his strategy just yet. Not even to her. Timing was everything, and if there was one thing JD Vance had mastered in his political career, it was the art of timing. Judge Greer resumed his monologue, layering accusation upon accusation, each one a calculated move to sway the jury and the public against Vance. Witnesses were called local business magnates, low-level operatives, all parroting a script that painted Vance as a power-hungry manipulator. Their stories were coordinated, their details rehearsed. It was a performance, and Greer was its director. But as the afternoon wore on, cracks began to appear. A slip in a witness timeline here, an inconsistency in a document there. Vance noticed them all, filing each one away in his mental arsenal. His composure never wavered, but a small, knowing smile began to play at the corners of his lips. The courtroom recessed for the day, and as the participants filed out, JD Vance lingered behind. He stood alone for a moment, gazing at the judge's bench. Then, with a quiet determination, he whispered to himself, "Let's see how far you'll go, Greer." The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial resumed the next morning. JD Vance entered the room with the same calm, calculated demeanor he had displayed the day before. The gallery was packed once again, with reporters whispering and cameras flashing, capturing every moment of the high-stakes drama. Outside, the chants of protesters, both for and against Vance, echoed faintly through the walls. Judge Edward Greer took his seat, his smirk firmly in place. He tapped his gavel lightly, more for show than necessity, and addressed the court. "Let us proceed with the testimony of our next witness," he announced, his tone dripping with authority. The prosecution called a local business magnate, Charles Whitmore, to the stand. Whitmore, a man with deep ties to the city's elite, adjusted his tie nervously as he took his seat. He glanced briefly at Greer, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. "Mr. Whitmore," the prosecutor began, "can you confirm that Vice President Vance pressured you into making financial contributions to his political campaign in exchange for favorable policies?" Whitmore hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, that's correct," he said, his voice steady but lacking conviction. JD Vance's attorney, Eleanor Parks, rose to her feet. "Your Honor, I request permission to cross-examine the witness." Greer waved his hand dismissively. "Proceed, Ms. Parks, but keep it brief." Eleanor approached the witness stand, her sharp eyes fixed on Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, can you provide specific details about these alleged interactions with Vice President Vance?" Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, he implied that my business would benefit if I contributed to his campaign." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Implied? Did he explicitly state this? Or are you interpreting his words?" Whitmore faltered. I suppose it was more of an implication." Eleanor pressed on. "And did you document these interactions? Emails, recordings, anything tangible?" Whitmore's face reddened. "No, I didn't." Eleanor turned to the jury, her voice firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, the witness has no concrete evidence to support his claims. This is hearsay, not fact." Greer slammed his gavel. "That's enough, Ms. Parks. Return to your seat." Eleanor complied, but not before exchanging a brief glance with Vance. He gave her a subtle nod, signaling his approval of her performance. As the trial continued, it became increasingly clear that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and coerced testimony. Witness after witness took the stand, each one parroting the same narrative, but their stories were riddled with inconsistencies. Meanwhile, JD Vance remained composed, his mind working tirelessly to piece together his strategy. He knew the system was stacked against him, but he also knew that the truth was on his side. He just needed the right moment to reveal it. That moment came during a recess. As Vance sat in a quiet corner of the courthouse, reviewing his notes, a court clerk approached him with a sealed envelope. "This was left for you, sir," the clerk said, handing it over. Vance opened the envelope cautiously. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that read, "The truth you need. Use it wisely." His heart raced as he inserted the drive into his laptop. The screen filled with files, audio recordings, emails, and financial documents, all pointing to a web of corruption involving Judge Greer and several local elites. The evidence was damning, but Vance knew he had to be strategic in how he used it. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. The tide was about to turn, but timing was everything. He decided to keep the evidence to himself for now, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash it. As the court reconvened, Judge Greer continued his efforts to control the narrative. He dismissed objections from Eleanor Parks with a wave of his hand and allowed the prosecution to present questionable evidence without challenge. The jury seemed uneasy, but Greer's authority loomed over them like a shadow. Vance sat silently, his expression unreadable. He knew the game Greer was playing, and he was ready to play his own. The evidence in his possession was a ticking time bomb, and when it went off, it would shake the courtroom to its core. The courtroom seemed like a stage, each participant playing their role in a twisted drama orchestrated by Judge Edward Greer. The prosecution continued to call witnesses, their stories so perfectly aligned that they began to feel rehearsed. Greer allowed their testimony without question, further solidifying the image of a biased court. As the day progressed, the atmosphere grew heavier. The jury, initially attentive, now seemed fatigued, their expressions harder to read. The reporters in the gallery scribbled notes with fervor, eager to capture every twist and turn. JD Vance remained stoic, his composure a stark contrast to the theatrics unfolding around him. "Next witness, Your Honor," the prosecutor announced, calling a former aide to Vance's office. The aide, a young man with nervous eyes, hesitated as he took the stand. He glanced at Greer, who gave him a subtle, reassuring nod. "Can you confirm," the prosecutor began, "that Vice President Vance pressured you to manipulate official documents for personal gain?" The aide swallowed hard. "Yes, that's correct," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor Parks rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This testimony appears to be coerced." Greer's gavel struck like a thunderclap. "Overruled. The witness will continue." Eleanor's frustration was palpable, but she held her ground. "Your Honor, I would like to question the witness about potential external pressures influencing his testimony." Greer smirked. "Denied. Move on, Ms. Parks." The gallery erupted into murmurs, the blatant manipulation too obvious to ignore. Vance leaned toward Eleanor and whispered, "Let it play out. The more he overreaches, the better it is for us." As the trial dragged on, Greer's confidence seemed unshakable. But Vance was patient. He knew the cracks in the facade were starting to show. He had the evidence, the USB drive with recordings and documents linking Greer to local elites, but he needed the perfect moment to reveal it. During a brief recess, Vance found himself alone in a quiet hallway. The noise of the courtroom faded, replaced by the distant hum of activity elsewhere in the courthouse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the USB drive, turning it over in his hand. His mind raced. The files on the drive were explosive. Conversations between Greer and local magnates discussing bribes, emails outlining efforts to manipulate the trial, and even bank statements showing illicit transactions. This was not just a defense, it was a weapon that could dismantle the entire corrupt operation. Eleanor approached him, her expression one of cautious optimism. "We're losing ground in there, JD. Whatever cards you're holding, it might be time to play them." Vance shook his head. "Not yet. Timing is everything. Greer needs to hang himself a little more. Trust me." She nodded, though her concern was evident. "Just don't wait too long. The jury's patience is wearing thin." Back in the courtroom, the prosecution called their final witness, a city contractor with alleged ties to Vance's office. The contractor's testimony was damning, painting Vance as a power-hungry politician who bent the rules for personal gain. "Your Honor," Eleanor interjected, "the defense reserves the right to question the legitimacy of this witness." Greer glared at her. "You are testing my patience, Ms. Parks. Proceed cautiously." Eleanor approached the witness stand, her voice steady and measured. "Mr. Larkin, you claim that Vice President Vance pressured you to approve contracts unlawfully. Can you provide specific evidence of this interaction?" Larkin faltered. "Well, no, but it was implied in our conversations." Eleanor's gaze hardened. "Implied? Did Vice President Vance ever explicitly instruct you to act outside the bounds of the law?" Larkin hesitated. "No, not explicitly." Eleanor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, once again we see testimony based on implications rather than facts. This is hearsay, not evidence." Greer slammed his gavel. "Enough. Ms. Parks, if you continue to challenge witnesses in this manner, I will hold you in contempt. Eleanor returned to her seat, her frustration evident. Vance leaned toward her and whispered, "You're doing fine. He's losing control." The day ended with an air of uncertainty. The prosecution had presented its case, but the cracks in their narrative were becoming increasingly apparent. Vance's calm confidence began to unsettle Greer, whose smirk now seemed forced. As the courtroom emptied, Vance stayed behind, his mind focused on the days ahead. The pieces were falling into place, and the moment to reveal the truth was drawing near. The courtroom pulsed with an electric tension as the trial continued. Judge Edward Greer, confident in his grip over the proceedings, pressed forward with a veneer of authority. He gestured for the prosecution to present what they claimed to be their final piece of damning evidence: a series of questionable financial records linking JD Vance to alleged misappropriations. Vance sat at the defense table, his expression resolute. He knew the evidence was fabricated, part of Greer's elaborate scheme to undermine him. But the time to play his hand was fast approaching, and every moment leading up to it was another stitch in the web Greer was weaving, one that would inevitably ensnare him. "Your Honor," Eleanor Parks stood, her voice ringing clear, "the defense would like to formally request a forensic audit of these financial records to ensure their validity before they are considered by the court." Greer smirked, tapping his gavel lightly. "Request denied. This court has full confidence in the integrity of the evidence presented by the prosecution." The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, the clear dismissal of due process sowing seeds of doubt. The gallery erupted in hushed murmurs, the reporters' pens racing to document the latest breach of fairness. Eleanor shot a look at Vance, her frustration evident. He met her gaze and gave her a subtle nod, his calm demeanor reassuring her. He mouthed two words, "Almost there." As the prosecutor continued their presentation, a ripple of unease began to spread through the room. The once confident jurors now appeared wary, their expressions betraying a growing skepticism of the court's impartiality. Then it happened. Vance stood, addressing the court directly. "Your Honor, I ask for permission to present new evidence that will demonstrate the truth behind these proceedings." Greer's smirk faltered for the first time. His voice hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Vance. This is not your time to speak." Vance remained standing, his voice steady and commanding. "This evidence is critical to the integrity of this court and the justice system. I will not sit down." The gallery erupted, the clicks of cameras and murmurs of the crowd growing louder. Greer slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order. I will not tolerate this insubordination." Vance reached into his briefcase, producing a laptop. He connected it to the courtroom's projector and, with a few keystrokes, brought up the first piece of evidence: a recording of Greer accepting bribes from a local magnate in exchange for influencing court rulings. The room froze. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The jurors sat wide-eyed, and even the prosecutor appeared stunned. Greer's face twisted with fury, his composure finally cracking. "What is the meaning of this?" Greer demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "The meaning is simple, Your Honor," Vance said, his voice cool and unyielding. "This recording, along with the other documents I now present to this court, exposes a pattern of corruption involving you and your associates. You have manipulated this trial and many others for personal gain." He brought up more files: bank statements showing illicit payments to Greer, emails coordinating the suppression of evidence, and even messages coercing witnesses to provide false testimony. The gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed in rapid succession, and the crowd's murmurs grew to a roar. Greer pounded his gavel, his voice drowned out by the uproar. "Order! Order in the court!" he bellowed, but it was no use. The tide had turned, and the once confident judge now appeared cornered. As the evidence continued to play out on the screen, the door to the courtroom opened. A group of federal agents entered, their presence silencing the crowd. They approached Greer, their expressions grim. Judge Edward Greer, one of the agents announced, "You are under investigation for corruption, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power." Please step down from the bench. Greer's face went pale. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. The agents surrounded him, and as they placed him in handcuffs, the room burst into applause. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she turned to Vance. You did it. Vance nodded, his expression solemn. Truth always wins. It just takes the right moment. As Greer was led out of the courtroom, the jurors looked at Vance with a newfound respect. The gallery erupted in cheers, and the reporters scrambled to capture the historic moment. For the first time since the trial began, the scales of justice tipped back toward balance. The courtroom quieted after the federal agents entered, their solemn presence further punctuating the downfall of Judge Greer. The once confident judge was now visibly shaken, his attempts to regain control extinguished by the undeniable weight of the evidence JD Vance had presented. As the agents stepped forward to take Greer into custody, a key development unfolded. From the back of the courtroom, Greer's own assistant, Sarah Caldwell, unexpectedly rose. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled, but there was a resoluteness in her expression that caught everyone's attention. Your Honor, she said, her voice breaking through the murmurs of the gallery, I have information relevant to these proceedings. I can no longer remain silent. All eyes turned to Sarah as Greer, now cornered, narrowed his eyes at her with a mix of fury and desperation. Sarah, he hissed, his voice a strained whisper. Think about what you're doing. But she ignored him, addressing the federal agents instead. I have evidence that corroborates the claims of corruption. Judge Greer instructed me to tamper with court documents and intimidate witnesses to build this case against Vice President Vance. I was complicit, but I can't let this go on any longer. The room froze. Sarah's admission was like a lightning strike, shocking everyone into stunned silence. The federal agents immediately turned to her, their expressions shifting from surprise to gratitude as they realized the magnitude of her confession. You're prepared to testify to this under oath? One of the agents asked. Sarah nodded. Yes. I have emails, directives, everything you need to prove the extent of Judge Greer's actions. Greer slammed his fist on the bench. This is outrageous. She's lying to save herself. His voice cracked under the weight of his fury, exposing the desperation he could no longer hide. But Sarah stood firm, her gaze locked on him. No, Judge. I'm telling the truth. And you know it. Eleanor Parks seized the opportunity, stepping forward with her trademark composure. Your Honor, she said, turning to the presiding judge who had been called in to replace Greer for the moment. I request that Sarah Caldwell's testimony and evidence be entered into the court record immediately. The presiding judge, a calm and collected figure, nodded. Granted. Ms. Caldwell, you may take the stand. As Sarah walked to the witness stand, Greer sank back into his chair, his face ashen. He muttered under his breath, his once dominant presence now reduced to a shadow of its former self. Sarah's testimony was devastating. She detailed the extent of Greer's corruption, describing how he had orchestrated the entire trial to destroy JD Vance's career. She provided emails, directives, and even recordings of private conversations where Greer openly discussed his plans with local elites. As the jury listened, their expressions shifted from shock to anger. The gallery was abuzz with murmurs, the reporters furiously documenting every word of Sarah's confession. The story had taken an unprecedented turn, and the weight of the truth was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, JD Vance watched from his seat, his composure steady. He had played his hand at the perfect moment, and now the truth was unraveling on its own. He glanced at Eleanor, who gave him a small, victorious smile. They were winning not just the trial but the fight for justice itself. As the federal agents gathered the evidence Sarah provided, one of them turned to the presiding judge. With the court's permission, we would like to detain Judge Greer immediately for further questioning and investigation. The judge nodded. Permission granted. Judge Greer, you are hereby relieved of your duties and placed under federal custody pending the investigation. The agents approached Greer, who now sat motionless, his smirk long gone. As they placed him in handcuffs, the gallery erupted into cheers. The once powerful judge, who had ruled his courtroom with arrogance and corruption, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Greer glared at JD Vance as he was led away, his eyes burning with unspoken threats. But Vance met his gaze with unwavering confidence. The fight was over, and justice had prevailed. Judge Edward Greer's defeat was cemented in the most dramatic and public way possible. Shackled and escorted out of the courtroom by federal agents, he left behind a legacy of corruption and manipulation that was now fully exposed to the world. The crowd outside the courthouse, having learned of the stunning developments, erupted into cheers and shouts of justice, their voices echoing into the San Francisco skyline. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. What once felt like a stage for scripted lies and manipulation was now a space brimming with vindication and hope. JD Vance stood tall at the defense table, his calm composure unwavering even in the face of a monumental victory. Eleanor Parks turned to him, a rare smile breaking across her face. "Congratulations, JD. You turned the tide right when it mattered most." Vance nodded, his expression remaining measured despite the wave of relief threatening to wash over him. "This wasn't just about winning my case, Eleanor. This was about proving that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Greer thought his connections and his corruption made him untouchable. He was wrong. The presiding judge, now firmly in control of the proceedings, addressed the court. "With the removal of Judge Greer from this case and the overwhelming evidence of misconduct brought to light, I hereby declare this trial dismissed, and all charges against Vice President JD Vance are dropped. This court will immediately recommend further investigations into the events surrounding this case." A resounding applause broke out in the gallery, reporters capturing every moment of the historic announcement. Vance's supporters cheered, their faith in him validated. Even the jurors, who had initially seemed uncertain, looked at him with a mixture of respect and admiration. As the courtroom emptied, Vance walked out into the bright San Francisco sun to face the awaiting crowd. Cheers erupted as he descended the courthouse steps, flanked by Eleanor and Sarah Caldwell, whose bravery had played a critical role in exposing Greer's corruption. Supporters surrounded him, shaking his hand and expressing their gratitude. At the bottom of the steps, Vance paused, turning to address the gathered crowd and the cameras broadcasting his words nationwide. His voice was steady, each word deliberate and charged with purpose. "This trial was not just about me. It was about the integrity of our justice system, the principles of fairness and accountability that are the foundation of our nation. Today, we've proven that no one, not even those in positions of great power, can evade the truth. But let me be clear, this is only the beginning. Corruption and injustice are not isolated, they are systemic. And it is our collective responsibility to stand up, speak out, and fight for what is right." The crowd roared its approval, and Vance raised his hand in acknowledgement before continuing. "To those who doubted and to those who supported me, I say this: justice is not a privilege, it is a right. And as long as I hold any position of authority, I will dedicate myself to ensuring that right for every American." As he stepped back from the podium, Eleanor leaned toward him. "That was powerful, JD. But you realize this just painted a bigger target on your back." Vance smiled slightly. "Let them target me. I'd rather fight in the open than let corruption hide in the shadows." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial sent shockwaves across the nation. Judge Greer faced federal prosecution for his corruption, and Sarah Caldwell's testimony led to further revelations about the network of elites who had conspired to influence the legal system. Several high-profile arrests followed, and the ripple effects were felt in courts far beyond San Francisco. For Vance, the trial became a defining moment in his career. The ordeal had tested his resolve, but it also highlighted his commitment to justice and transparency. It galvanized his supporters and silenced many of his critics, who could no longer deny his integrity. But more than that, the trial sparked a broader conversation about the accountability of those in power. Communities across the nation demanded greater oversight of the judiciary, and reforms were proposed to safeguard against abuses like those orchestrated by Greer. On a quiet evening months after the trial, Vance sat in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought of the risks he had taken, the truths he had uncovered, and the people, like Eleanor and Sarah, who had stood by him when it mattered most. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah, holding a folder filled with new documents. "More follow-ups from the investigation," she said with a small smile. "Looks like Greer's network went deeper than we thought." Vance nodded, taking the folder. "Then we keep going. The fight doesn't end here." Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "JD, do you ever wonder if it's worth it? Taking on something so big, knowing the risks?" He looked at her, his expression resolute. "Every single day. Because if we don't fight, who will?" As Sarah left, Vance leaned back in his chair, a quiet determination settling over him. The path ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready. The trial had been a battle, but the war for justice was far from over. And JD Vance, with his unyielding resolve and unwavering belief in the truth, would be at the forefront of that fight. This cinematic and intense story concludes with JD Vance triumphing over corruption in a dramatic courtroom battle. His strategic use of evidence exposes the corrupt Judge Greer, leading to justice not just for himself but for a system marred by abuse. The narrative explores themes of resilience, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of truth. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.